very honored to have you right now, Mr. Kanya, because you're a very experienced teacher and you're a very experienced man. So we have a few questions we'd like to ask you about civil rights and your experience with civil rights throughout your whole life. How did your father being in the military impact your life?
We got to travel around different parts of the world. We lived in different parts of the world. We lived with different cultures, and it helped us to understand that there are all kinds of different people and values, and you learn to blend in with them, and recognize the fact that sometimes they do things and think differently than you do, but doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong.
The issues that were going on in the 60s, you were a witness of them, weren't you?
In the 60s, I was a kid, but I was old enough that I started to understand, what some of the issues were. We watched the news, we read the newspapers. Having been from Michigan and Detroit, Detroit riots were a really, really big deal. And so I remember my parents talking about it. I remember driving through parts of the city that were, burned and things like that. And it was obviously a big concern with Americans.
Did you ever consider participating in the protests? Did you have any people that you know that were a part of the protests or were affected?
Not really. I traveled around so much, so a lot of times I was never in a place where, where the civil rights protests actually were. I wasn't, when I was small around Detroit, I was too small to really get involved. And then the rest of the time we were living over in Europe, and it really wasn't much going on there. You got to remember, there was no internet, there was no satellite TV, there was no cable TV, and so everything was really limited to, local news. Having said that, I know, some of my relatives were, not involved with it as far as participating, but they were certainly aware of it because it was happening all around them.
So what was your the most vivid memory you have of the time period, or the thing that you will most remember? It's just something that just will forever be kept in your mind and your memory.
When we're probably going back to the city of Detroit when they had the riots, and then I remember, because in order for us to go visit our grandparents, we had to drive right through the parts of Detroit that were devastated. And I remember, even as a young kid, seeing the buildings that were burned, and the trash and the debris and things like that. Didn't really see too much as far as the riots themselves. Everything that my experience was basically, because of that time frame, was pretty much limited to what I saw, just sitting in a car driving back and forth. As a personal experience, as far as not necessarily like race riots, but just race relations.
Yeah.
And because things are very tense. When I was on my grandfather's farm, there was a creek that went by there, and I remember this African American gentleman, probably in his 40s or 50s, drove up there, and I was just sitting, just sort of hanging around the creek because it was a fun thing to do as a kid. And he asked me, are there fish in there? And I said, yeah. He says, well, is it okay if I fish? I says, well, I wouldn't recommend He says, why? Because I'm a black person? I said, no, not because you're a black person, it's because the creek is polluted and the fish are contaminated. So he was very sensitive about the fact that I didn't want him to fish there, but it had nothing to do with his race. It had everything to do with, I didn't really want him to catch and eat fish from a polluted river.
Okay, so that brought up one last question. Yeah, it's like early, like in the 80s, how more Hispanic Americans or Hispanics came into the United States. Were they treated like similarly? They became treated similarly as like African Americans back in the 60s. Did you see that?
Well, again, because I really didn't get a lot of experience living in the Southwest until after that time frame. It's hard to say, you know, I don't remember anything in particular about any serious racial issues between Hispanics and Anglos per se. Again, because being in the military, people are very integrated and they support each other a lot more.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it wasn't there. It's just that it wasn't as common as it would be. You know, and again, go back to the military. I think one of the great things about it is because you're being forced to work together and live together, you learn to get along with each other because sometimes your life depended on it.
Yeah.
You know.